The coffee was still warm when Brantley discovered his world had shattered. He'd stepped out of his weathered cabin into the crisp Montana dawn, tin cup in hand, expecting to see Copper's familiar chestnut coat gleaming in the early light. Instead, he found an empty corral and a piece of paper pinned to the gate post with a railroad spike. 3 words, scrawled in hurried script, "Don't follow." Brantley's weathered hands trembled as he read the note again, his 47 years of hard living suddenly feeling like a crushing weight. Copper wasn't just a horse, he was the last living reminder of his father, the only creature that had stayed loyal through the drought that killed his cattle, the creditors who took his land, and the loneliness that had eaten away at him like acid. The tracks in the dust told a story. Copper's hoofprints, familiar as his own heartbeat, led away from the corral alongside the prints of 2 other horses and boots. 3 riders had come in the night, silent as shadows. Professional work. Brantley circled the corral, his trackers eye-catching details others would miss. A cigarette butt, hand-rolled with expensive tobacco. A horseshoe print with a distinctive nick on the left side. Most telling of all, a small piece of fabric caught on the fence wire, purple silk, the kind worn by wealthy folks from back east. His neighbor, Mordecai Flint, had been circling like a vulture for months, making offers on what remained of Brantley's homestead. "That horse of yours is worth more than this whole spread," Flint had said just last week, his pale eyes lingering on Copper with an hunger that made Brantley's skin crawl. But this felt different. The note, the careful tracks, the silence. This was personal. Brantley saddled his backup mount, a sturdy paint mare named Sage, his movements automatic despite the rage building in his chest. He'd raised Copper from a colt, taught him to respond to whistle commands, shared countless nights under the stars. The horse knew him better than any human ever had. As he prepared to leave, he found another clue that chilled his blood. Scratched into the dirt near the water trough were symbols he recognized from his army days, the same markings used by a group of mercenaries who'd terrorized settlements during the border conflicts. Men who took what they wanted and left bodies in their wake. The sun climbed higher as Brantley studied the trail, noting how the kidnappers had avoided the main road, choosing instead to follow deer paths through the timber. They knew the country, knew how to move without being seen. This wasn't random theft, it was calculated, planned. His decision crystallized like ice in winter. The note had said don't follow, but whoever wrote it didn't know Brantley Cade. He'd tracked Apache raiders through Badlands, survived 3 winters trapping in the Rockies, and buried more friends than most men made in a lifetime. They'd taken the wrong horse from the wrong man. Checking his rifle one last time, Brantley swung into the saddle. Sage snorted and pawed the ground, sensing his determination. The trail led north toward the Bitterroot Mountains, where a man could disappear forever or make others disappear. The hunt had begun. 3 hours into the pursuit, Brantley found the first body. The man lay sprawled beside a creek, his chest torn open by what looked like bare claws. But Brantley knew better. He'd seen cavalry sabers do similar damage during the war. The corpse wore the same purple silk vest as the fabric he'd found at his corral, and his boots matched one set of tracks from the crime scene. Honor among thieves, it seemed, was as rare as snow in July. Sage nickered nervously as Brantley examined the scene. The remaining 2 horses and riders had continued north, but now there were signs of haste in their passage: broken branches, disturbed stones, the kind of trail left by men running scared. What had spooked them enough to kill their own partner? The answer came as Brantley reached a ridge overlooking the Clearwater Valley. Through his father's old spyglass, he spotted movement in the distance, 2 riders pushing hard through the timber, and between them, the unmistakable form of Copper. Even at this distance, Brantley could see his horse favoring his left front leg. The bastards had hurt him. But something else caught his attention. A third group was shadowing the horse thieves, moving parallel through the trees like ghosts. These riders wore no colors, left barely any trail, and moved with the fluid precision of professional hunters. The game had more players than he'd realized. Brantley pushed Sage harder, following game trails and old logging roads that cut straight through the terrain while the others wound around obstacles. His years of solitary living had taught him every hidden path in these mountains. every shortcut and secret passage. By late afternoon, he'd closed the gap enough to hear voices carried on the wind. The horse thieves had stopped to rest near an abandoned mining camp, their horses lathered and exhausted. Through the spyglass, Brantley recognized one of the men, Cordell Vance, a gun for hire who'd been run out of 3 territories for robbery and worse. The other man was a stranger, tall and lean with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore a long coat despite the heat, and when he removed his hat to wipe his brow, Brantley caught a glimpse of silver hair and a face marked by old scars. They were arguing. Vance gestured angrily toward the mountains while the silver-haired man remained calm, almost amused. Whatever they were discussing, it involved more than just stealing a horse. Copper stood tied to a picket line, his proud head hanging with exhaustion. The sight sent fresh fury through Brantley's veins. His horse had been bred for endurance, not this kind of brutal pace over rough terrain. As he prepared to move closer, Brantley caught movement in his peripheral vision. The third group had positioned themselves on the opposite ridge, and now he could see them clearly, 3 figures in dark clothing, one of whom was studying the camp through a telescope similar to his own. The hunter had become the hunted, and everyone was hunting everyone else. Brantley settled back to wait. Experience had taught him that patience often accomplished more than action. Let the others make their moves first, reveal their intentions and capabilities. He'd learned the art of waiting during long nights on guard duty, watching for Confederate raiders who might never come. As shadows lengthened across the valley, the mysterious third group began to move. They descended toward the mining camp with the purposeful coordination of wolves circling prey, their movements suggesting military training. The silver-haired man noticed them first. His hand dropping to his sidearm, Vance followed his gaze and cursed loud enough for Brantley to hear across the distance. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to be violent, and Copper was caught in the middle of it. Brantley checked his ammunition and began his own descent, keeping to the shadows as 3 separate forces prepared for a confrontation that would determine his horse's fate and possibly his own. The first shot shattered the mountain silence. Like breaking glass, Brantley watched from his concealed position as chaos erupted in the mining camp below. The mysterious third group had attacked without warning, their movements coordinated and lethal. Vance had managed to find cover behind an overturned cart, but his companion, the silver-haired man, stood in the open, calmly returning fire. With a precision that spoke of decades of experience, Copper reared and screamed as bullets whined past his tether, the sound cutting through Brantley like a blade. His horse was trapped in the crossfire, and every instinct screamed at him to charge down the slope, guns blazing. But 47 years of hard living had taught him the value of patience. The attackers moved like professionals, using overlapping fields of fire and tactical positioning that reminded Brantley of his cavalry days. They weren't bounty hunters or common outlaws. These were soldiers or former soldiers, executing a military operation. One of them broke cover to advance on Copper's position, and Brantley finally saw his face clearly. The man was young, maybe 25, with the kind of clean-shaven features that belonged in a city, not these wild mountains. More importantly, he wore a small pin on his jacket, a silver eagle that Brantley recognized from his army service. Pinkerton agents. The pieces began falling into place. The careful planning, the professional execution, the willingness to kill their own partner when he became a liability. This wasn't about stealing a horse, it was about using Copper as bait. For him, the silver-haired man had noticed the advancing Pinkerton and shifted his aim with fluid grace. His shot took the agent's center mass, spinning him around before he collapsed in the dust. The remaining two Pinkertons immediately focused their fire on the man's position, but he'd already moved, flowing from cover to cover like smoke. Vance wasn't faring as well. Blood stained his shirt sleeve, and his return fire was becoming increasingly wild and desperate. He kept glancing toward Copper, clearly calculating whether he could reach the horse and escape. That's when Brantley made his move. He'd circled around to approach from the blind side of the camp, using an old mine shaft as cover. The years of hunting and being hunted had taught him to move silently, to become part of the landscape. Now he ghost-walked through the ruins of the mining operation, his rifle ready. closing the distance to his horse. The silver-haired man spotted him first, their eyes meeting across 30 yards of broken ground. Instead of raising his weapon, the man nodded slightly, a gesture of recognition that sent chills down Brantley's spine. "Brantley." "Cade," the man called out during a lull in the gunfire, his voice carrying easily across the camp. "Been a long time." The voice triggered memories that Brantley had tried to bury. Colonel Dryas Worthington, his commanding officer during the Apache campaigns. The man who'd ordered him to track hostile bands through impossible terrain. Who'd sent him on missions that were barely distinguishable from suicide. The man who'd disappeared after the war, amid rumors of stolen Army gold and murdered witnesses. Worthington. Brantley kept his rifle trained on his former colonel while scanning for the remaining Pinkertons. "Figured you were dead by now. Reports of my demise were greatly exaggerated." Worthington's smile was cold as winter steel, though the same can't be said for most of the men who served under me. The implication hit Brantley like a physical blow. The other members of his old unit, men he'd considered brothers, had been dying over the past few years. Accidents, robberies gone wrong, mysterious disappearances. He'd attributed it to the hard luck that seemed to follow old soldiers. Now he understood the truth. Vance chose that moment to make his break for copper, sprinting across open ground with his gun blazing. One of the surviving Pinkertons cut him down before he'd covered half the distance. But his sacrifice created the distraction Worthington needed. The colonel moved like a striking snake, putting two bullets into the Pinkerton's chest before pivoting to engage the last agent. The final exchange lasted less than 3 seconds, ending with Worthington standing over two more bodies. Suddenly, the mountain camp was silent except for the sound of Copper's labored breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Brantley and Worthington faced each other across the blood-soaked ground. Two aging warriors with a history written in gunpowder and betrayal. "You took my horse to get to me," Brantley said, statement rather than question. "Had to. You're the last one, Cade. The last witness to what really happened at Apache Canyon." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and Brantley felt the weight of 23 years settling on his shoulders like a burial shroud. Apache Canyon. The name alone was enough to resurrect ghosts that Brantley had spent decades trying to forget. "You remember, don't you?" Worthington's voice carried across the silence like smoke from a funeral pyre. "September 23rd, 1874. You were the scout that day, leading us to what you thought was a peaceful Apache camp." Brantley's grip tightened on his rifle. The memories came flooding back, women and children fleeing in terror. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with burning canvas. The weight of gold coins in saddlebags that should have contained military supplies. They were under a flag of truce, Brantley said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Coming to negotiate safe passage to the reservation. They were in the way." Worthington's scarred face showed no emotion. The mining consortium had paid good money for that land, and peaceful Apaches don't make for profitable newspaper headlines. The massacre had been disguised as a battle, the official reports describing a heroic victory against hostile raiders. But Brantley had seen the truth: unarmed families cut down while trying to surrender, sacred items looted from burning lodges, evidence destroyed to protect wealthy men in distant cities. He'd kept quiet like a good soldier until 3 days later, when he'd stumbled upon Worthington and two other officers dividing stolen Apache gold in a canyon 20 miles from the massacre site. "You should have minded your own business, Cade. Should have reported you when I had the chance." Worthington laughed, a sound like grinding bone. "To who? Half the territorial government was in on it. The other half didn't want to know." Copper whinnied softly, drawing Brantley's attention. His horse was watching him with those intelligent dark eyes, waiting for his human to make things right. The sight strengthened his resolve. "So you've been hunting down the witnesses," Brantley said, making sure no one's left to tell the truth. "Justice has a long memory, Cade, and I've become very good at delivering it." The colonel's hand was steady on his weapon, but Brantley noticed the slight tremor in his left shoulder, an old wound, probably from the war. Age was catching up to both of them, but Worthington had let arrogance cloud his judgment. He'd positioned himself in the open, confident in his reputation and skill. "There's something you never knew about that day," Brantley said, buying time, while he calculated angles and distances. "Something I found after you left with your blood money." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Worthington's eyes. The Apache chief you murdered, Gray Wolf, he'd brought more than just his family. To that peace meeting, he'd brought evidence. Documents proving that the mining consortium was using Apache raids as cover for their own crimes, letters signed by territorial officials, payment records, everything needed to expose the whole conspiracy. Worthington's confidence cracked. "You're lying. Hidden them in a cave near the canyon. Been waiting 23 years for the right moment to use them." Brantley smiled grimly. "Figured killing me might be harder if you knew the truth would come out anyway." The colonel's face went white. "Where? Dead man's secret, Worthington." The standoff stretched like a drawn bowstring. Two old soldiers locked in a final confrontation that had been decades in the making. Around them, the mountain shadows lengthened as afternoon faded toward evening. Copper chose that moment to act. The horse had been quietly working at his tether, while the humans talked, using intelligence born of years of partnership with Brantley. Now he broke free with a sudden surge of strength, charging directly between the two armed men. Worthington's shot went wide as Copper barreled past him. Brantley's didn't. The colonel staggered backward, clutching his chest, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with something approaching surprise. "The documents," he wheezed. "Where?" Brantley walked over to his dying enemy, keeping his rifle ready. "There are no documents, Worthington. Gray Wolf was just a man trying to save his people. But you never understood that honor means more than gold." Worthington collapsed, his eyes losing focus as life drained away. His last words were barely audible. "All those years. For nothing." Brantley holstered his weapon and walked to Copper, running his hands over the horse's legs and flanks, checking for injuries. The animal was exhausted and dehydrated, but essentially sound. "Easy, boy," he murmured, stroking the familiar chestnut neck. "We're going home." The ride back to civilization took 2 days, with Brantley pushing neither himself nor Copper. They followed old elk trails through pine forests, staying clear of main roads where curious lawmen might ask uncomfortable questions about dead Pinkerton agents and missing colonels. But as they descended from the high country, Brantley realized his troubles were far from over. The Pinkertons had been tracking him for a reason, and Worthington's death wouldn't end their interest. If anything, it would intensify their investigation. They'd want to know why a decorated Civil War officer had died in a remote mountain camp, and they'd keep digging until they uncovered the truth about Apache Canyon, which meant the conspiracy Worthington had killed to protect might finally see the light of day. That evening, camped beside a creek that fed into the Bitterroot River, Brantley made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't run from the past anymore. Couldn't let the ghosts of Apache Canyon continue haunting the present. It was time to tell the truth. His first stop was the telegraph office in Hamilton, a timber town where nobody asked questions about strangers with trail dust and hard eyes. The message he sent was addressed to Lysander Webb, a newspaper editor in Denver who'd built a reputation for exposing government corruption. "Have story about Apache Canyon massacre. Meet me in Missoula. Come alone. Becade." The response came within hours. "On my way. This better be worth it." Webb arrived 3 days later on the evening train, a small man with ink-stained fingers and the hungry look of someone who lived for the next big story. Brantley met him at the station, Copper waiting patiently at the hitching post. "You're either very brave or very stupid," Webb said without preamble. "Half the territorial government wants you dead, and the other half wants to pretend you don't exist. The truth needs telling. Truth's a luxury most folks can't afford." Webb studied Brantley's weathered face in the lamplight. "But I'm listening." They rode out to a cabin Brantley had rented under a false name, deep in the mountains where conversations couldn't be overheard. For 6 hours, Brantley told the story he'd kept buried for 23 years. He described the massacre in detail, named names, provided dates and locations that could be verified. Webb listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. When Brantley finished, the editor sat in silence for several minutes. "You realize what this means," Webb finally said. Some of the most powerful men in the territory will be destroyed. Others will kill to prevent that from happening. They've been killing anyway, at least this way. The deaths might mean something. Webb nodded slowly. I'll need corroborating evidence, witnesses, documents, anything that can support your testimony. Brantley had been thinking about this for days. There's a man in Billings, a former Army clerk named Vernon Pike. He processed the after-action reports from Apache Canyon, saw the discrepancies between the official version and what really happened. Still alive, last I heard. And there's an Apache woman named Morning Star who survived the massacre. She's living on the Flathead Reservation now, married to a man named Joseph Three Hawks. Webb made more notes. This is going to take months to investigate properly. You'll need to stay hidden until the story breaks. They'll come for you once they realize what you're doing. That night, alone with Copper under the Montana stars, Brantley felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope. Not for himself, he'd accepted long ago that his life would end violently, but for the memory of Grey Wolf and his people, for the other soldiers who died to protect Worthington's secret, for the possibility that justice might finally prevail. Copper nudged his shoulder, seeking the sugar cubes Brantley always carried. As he fed the horse, Brantley reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. He'd spent years as a hermit, trying to forget the past, only to discover that confronting it might be the most important thing he'd ever done. What do you think, boy? He murmured to Copper, ready to make some history. The horse's gentle snort seemed like agreement. Over the following weeks, Webb's investigation gained momentum. Vernon Pike confirmed the discrepancies in the Apache Canyon reports. Morning Star provided devastating testimony about the massacre, her words carrying the weight of lived experience. Other witnesses emerged from hiding, encouraged by the possibility that their stories might finally be heard. But with each revelation, the danger grew. Brantley received word that armed men were asking questions in his hometown, that his cabin had been searched, that a reward was being offered for information about his whereabouts. The conspiracy was fighting back, using every resource at its disposal to silence the truth. The final confrontation was coming, and this time, Brantley wouldn't be facing it alone. The story broke on a Tuesday morning that would reshape the American West. Webb's expose filled for full pages of the Denver Tribune, with supporting articles in newspapers across 3 territories. The headline read, "The Apache Canyon Conspiracy: How Government Officials and Mining Interests Orchestrated Massacre for Profit." Below it, a smaller subtitle, "Survivor Breaks 23 Years Silence." Brantley read the newspaper in a safe house outside Missoula, Copper grazing peacefully in the yard outside. The story was everything he'd hoped for: meticulously researched, powerfully written, impossible to dismiss or ignore. By noon, the territorial governor had called for a federal investigation. By evening, 3 prominent officials had resigned and 2 mining executives were in custody. The conspiracy that had seemed untouchable just weeks before was crumbling like a house built on sand. But the victory came with a price. "They're coming," Webb said, bursting into the cabin as the sun set behind the mountains. A dozen men, maybe more. Professional killers hired by what's left of the consortium. They'll be here within the hour. Brantley checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. "How many rounds you got?" "I'm a newspaperman, not a gunfighter." "Today you're both." They prepared the cabin for siege, overturning furniture for barricades, positioning extra ammunition within easy reach. Copper seemed to sense the danger. Pawing restlessly at his tether, his ears pricked toward the approaching darkness. The attack came with the first shadows of night. Muzzle flashes lit the forest, like deadly fireflies, as bullets shattered windows and splintered wood. The consortium's hired killers had surrounded the cabin, professional in their approach, but underestimating their quarry's determination. Brantley moved from window to window, placing his shots with the precision of someone who'd learned marksmanship in a harder school than most men could imagine. Beside him, Webb proved surprisingly capable with a rifle. His shots guided more by desperation than skill, but effective nonetheless. The siege stretched through the night, punctuated by brief firefights. When the attackers tried to rush the cabin, each assault was repelled but Brantley knew they were running low on ammunition and options. Dawn brought an unexpected sound, cavalry horns echoing across the valley. Federal marshals crested the ridge in a thunder of hoofbeats, led by a grim-faced man who dismounted and approached the cabin under a white flag. The hired killers melted into the forest like smoke, unwilling to face legitimate law enforcement. Brantley Cade, the marshal called out. Marshal William Driscoll, U.S. Marshals Service. You can come out. You're under federal protection now. The aftermath unfolded like a dream. The surviving members of the Apache Canyon conspiracy were arrested, tried, and convicted. The mining consortium's assets were seized and sold, with the proceeds going to establish schools on Apache reservations. Worthington's personal effects, discovered in a Denver bank vault, contained detailed records of the conspiracy that corroborated every aspect of Brantley's testimony. Most importantly, Gray Wolf and his people were finally remembered not as hostile raiders, but as victims of a terrible injustice. The federal government offered Brantley a substantial reward for his role in exposing the conspiracy, money that would have solved all his financial problems. He turned it down, asking instead that it be added to the Apache Education Fund. "What will you do now?" Webb asked as they prepared to part ways in Missoula. Brantley looked at Copper, who was already saddled and ready for the trail. His horse had been the catalyst for everything that followed, the thread that connected past and present, justice and redemption. "Think we'll head south," he said. "Maybe see some new country." They rode out that afternoon, man and horse together, as they'd always been, but with a lightness in their steps that hadn't been there before. The ghosts of Apache Canyon had finally been laid to rest, the truth told, the accounts balanced. Behind them, the mountains held their secrets close, but ahead lay open trails and endless possibilities. For the first time in 23 years, Brantley Cade was truly free. As they crested a hill overlooking the valley, Copper paused and looked back, as if saying goodbye to the place where justice had finally been served. Then he turned toward the horizon, carrying his rider toward whatever adventures awaited them. The bond between a man and his horse had proven stronger than conspiracy, corruption, and time itself. Some things, Brantley reflected as they rode into the sunset, were worth fighting for no matter the cost. Behind them, the truth lived on in newspaper morgues and court records, in the memories of children who would grow up knowing their ancestors. Real story in the knowledge that sometimes justice might be delayed but would never be denied. The cowboy and his horse rode on, legends in their own time, guardians of a truth that would outlive them both.